Well, hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for being here for our Explorers Series event tonight. We're really excited about this event titled Antarctic Ecosystems from Microscopic Plants to Penguins. And we're going to be joined by two scientists here at NSF NCAR, Kristen Krumhardt and Alice DuVivier. My name is Evan Portier, and I work here at NSF NCAR as an educator. In case folks don't know, NSF NCAR stands for the National Science Foundation National Center for Atmospheric Research. I know that can be a mouthful, otherwise known as NSF NCAR. We're a world-leading organization dedicated to understanding Earth system science and how that science can be used to build national resilience and protect communities. I have a few housekeeping notes before handing it off to Alice and Kristen. If you have questions about the presentation, we ask that you wait until the end of the presentation. If you're in person, we'll come around with a microphone and you can ask your question then. For our online audience, you can use the Slido platform. What you'll do is you'll scroll down right below the live cast and you'll see a join event button, a green button. If you haven't click that now and you'll see a Q&A tab. They also, as in Alice and Kristen, have a few questions for us. So for both our in-person and online audience, you can respond on the Slido platform. For those in person, you can use your phone or laptop to navigate to slido.com and enter the code Explorer Series or scan the QR code. Just so you all know, this event is being recorded and will be put on our Explorer Series webpage later on. So if you know any folks that missed it, feel free to point them to the website. I also want to acknowledge the art piece that many of you have taken some photos with that are just outside on our mezzanine. That is an art piece by John Weller, who's in the audience right over there. Yeah, we can go ahead and give a round of applause. A few words about John real quickly. He's a writer, photographer, and filmmaker who works to drive marine conservation around the world and is excited to return to NSF NCAR with this small piece of his new exhibit, Antarctica, Peace Through Science. It was co-developed with leading Antarctic scientists and is a culmination of John's 21 years of Antarctic science communication. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen and Alice, and they're going to be displaying our word cloud that some of you might have filled out. And so with that, let's go ahead and give Alice and Kristen a round of applause.
All right, so we think that you guys filled out a word cloud about what comes to mind when you think about Antarctica. We're going to bring that up. All right, maybe we'll do it at the end. Sorry, there's a box up there. Hang on, we got the. Okay, here we go. Okay.
Oh, penguins.
So fantastic. We were there last year. We got lots of penguins, lots of cold ice. We got a penguin emoji. A number of people did that.
Icebergs and penguins.
Alice has been there. I don't know who put that.
That's true.
My mom, Alice. Desert, that's a good one too. Wind, lots of penguins, ice, Shackleford. So amazing scenery. So these are kind of the things that we thought might come up as people thought about this. And as we talk to you, we'll see if some of your thoughts change. We won't bring this up again at the end, but you can think about what's up here now and see if it changes later. All right, so we will shift now to our presentation. All right, so we just answered this question. And before we get started, we just wanted to introduce ourselves a little bit. So hi, I'm Alice DuVivier. As you heard, I'm a scientist here at NSF NCAR. I am a polar Earth system modeler. I grew up here in Boulder, so this is a picture of me as a kid. We spent lots of time outside hiking and doing lots of kind of typical Boulder things. And when I went to college, I ended up majoring in physics. This was before college, but that's me with a Van de Graaff generator. But what I learned in college was that I really preferred more applied physics to the Earth system rather than really theoretical physics. So I like being outside and learning about the Earth. And so that kind of took me to graduate school here at CU Boulder. And I still study the polar regions here in Boulder. And I still spend lots of time outside. So that's me with my family on a bike ride in the past year or so. And I mentioned that I'm a polar Earth system modeling scientist. So I study both poles, both the Arctic and the Antarctic, as you can see here. I got asked on the way in. I have been to the Antarctic. I went in graduate school. So those are the pictures on the left here of going down to Antarctica. And I have also been to Alaska, the northernmost village in Alaska, UCAR, for some sea ice field schools. So those are those pictures. But what I really spend most of my time doing is being on a computer. So I've been lucky enough to go to both these places, but I don't go there most of the time for my work.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Kristen Krumhardt, and I am a biological oceanographer, an Earth system modeling scientist, and a scientific illustrator. I grew up in Iowa, and here's a picture of me back then. And I spent a lot of time in nature, just like Alice, around in the woods behind my parents' house and looking at the lakes and streams around there. But I always loved visiting the ocean, both as a kid and during college. And this is me at the Great Barrier Reef on a biology field trip, looking at the corals there and the incredible biodiversity. And then I continued my interest in the oceans, going into grad school. And I started growing ocean algae in the lab. You can see them in the culture vessels there. They're kind of green because they have algae in them. But then I got really interested in how these microorganisms really affect the global climate and the global carbon cycle. And so that really brought me here to NSF NCAR, trying to scale up my interest in biology to a global scale. And as my projects kind of evolved as I've been here, and I've gotten more and more interested in applying the Earth system model to ecosystems and looking at conservation and stuff. I'm also a scientific illustrator. I like to draw what I study, and really my science is the inspiration for most of the artwork that I do. So you can see a different variety of my artwork here, but you'll see it also scattered throughout our talk today. So, yep, and then Alice, do you want to, I'll just go sit down.
Okay. So we wanted to also just bring up from the very start that the work that we're presenting today is the result of a lot of interdisciplinary collaborations. So these projects that we'll be talking about have really relied on working with biologists, not necessarily biological modelers, but people who actually go out in the field into the penguin colonies, other Earth system modelers, software engineers, and then a number of people who work more in the policy space, like John Weller, who's here, or Cassandra Brooks, who we'll bring up later. So this really wouldn't have been possible without all these people, and we want to emphasize science is really, collaborations in a process, and that we're really thankful to all these people. So a little roadmap of where we're going today. We're first going to talk to you about Antarctica, why it's special in a number of reasons, in a number of ways. And then we'll talk a bit about modeling the Earth, how we do that here at NSF NCAR. We'll give you some of our science results that we think are really exciting and neat. And then we'll talk a little bit about Antarctic management and the ecosystems and what that means and things that you might be able to do to impact that. All right, so Antarctica is special. We asked you to think about what you think about when you're in Antarctica. So let's transport ourselves. We're here at the Mesa Lab in Boulder, or you're online wherever you are. So imagine we blast off in our rocket ship from here in Colorado and we go straight to Antarctica. This is not how you actually go. It's a much longer trip. But you can imagine now we're in our satellite over the South Pole. And this is kind of what you'd see if you were looking at Antarctica. So we want to just make sure that we establish, we'll keep showing you this map over time, and it's going to be in the same orientation. But we want to point out where different places are. So the Weddell Sea is over here, just to the side of the Antarctic Peninsula that you can see coming up towards South America right here. You have the Transantarctic Mountains that kind of run right along here. You have the Ross Sea right here, and then we have West Antarctica to this side of the Transantarctic Mountains and East Antarctica over here. And what you would see if you're in this magical satellite that just stays above the South Pole is that Antarctica is a frozen continent, but it's also surrounded by a frozen ocean. And so what you're seeing here, sorry, I'm not used to this pointer, so anyway, what you see around Antarctica here is sea ice, and this is actually frozen ocean water. When the oceans get cold enough, the ocean water actually freezes, and this is because Antarctica experiences 6 months of darkness per year, and it's the coldest, windiest place on the planet. So it's really unique. When we asked you to think about, what you think about with Antarctica, my guess is that a lot of you guys thought about things like this. I saw Shackelford. I think maybe that was thinking of Shackleton, and their expedition was right here. You can see this boat crushed in the ice. The sled dog teams, these dogs look very, very cold. The race to the South Pole of Scott from the UK, his team, and then Amundsen from Norway. And so this is a lot of what people think about. And you might have also thought about things like vast mountains coming out of the ocean, lots of ice, penguins. Penguins are a big thing. But there's a lot of Antarctica beyond that, and hopefully we'll introduce you to at least some of that today. All right, so here's our map of Antarctica. I want to talk to you a little bit about why Antarctica is a really special place. So one of the things that makes Antarctica so special is something called the Antarctic Treaty. There are 54 countries that have signed on to this. And what's really special is that it designates Antarctica as a place that can only be used for peaceful purposes. So what's allowed to happen in Antarctica is science, peaceful things, cooperation. What is not allowed to happen are any military activities, anything nuclear, so no nuclear power, no nuclear weapons. You can't mine, and all territorial claims have been suspended. And you can kind of see that in this map here of the different bases around Antarctica and all the different countries. So the flags that you see are the country whose base is there. And so you can see there's different countries that have bases all around Antarctica. But we want to emphasize, too, that many of them are along the coast because that's the easiest place to get to in many cases. Another way that Antarctica is kind of unique in ways that humans interact with it is tourism. So I heard some people, as they were coming in, say that they've been to Antarctica. And there are a number of people who come, and the way that people usually get here would be to go to Ushuaia in Argentina, which is that red dot there. You could get on a cruise ship. These are pictures of cruise ships in Ushuaia. And most people who come to Antarctica would come via a cruise ship. And then you have to cross the Drake Passage, so I hope you don't get seasick. I do. I didn't go this way, fortunately. But most of the people who come, they end up going to the peninsula. So there's not very much of Antarctica that actually gets visited by tourists. It's mostly concentrated in the peninsula. Another thing that might or might not be surprising to you is that there is also commercial fishing that happens in the Southern Ocean around Antarctica. So there's kind of two main fisheries. The first one is Antarctic toothfish, also marketed as Chilean sea bass, and you can see kind of where some of those fisheries are here. And so this is kind of like a luxury food item. And then the other thing that gets fished in the Southern Ocean is krill, which are these very small shrimp-like creatures. You'll hear more about them. And they're marketed as sources of omega-3 oils. So you can see some here for humans on top and animals on the bottom if you want your dog to have a very glossy coat from eating Southern Ocean krill. So these are some of the ways that we think Antarctica is really unique and special and different. And Kristen's now going to come talk a little bit more about the Antarctic ecosystem.
So yeah, I'll talk a bit about this very special ecosystem, which is amazing. But the first thing that I'm going to touch on is talking about, well, it's hard to point with these, but these microscopic plants that we referred to in our title. These are actually phytoplankton, and they're important for all marine ecosystems, not just Antarctica. But so I'll start with that big picture. So phytoplankton are really one of my favorite things to study. They are these microscopic, tiny floating plants in the ocean. And I call them plants because they're doing photosynthesis. So they're taking sunlight and converting that into sugars via photosynthesis with the sunlight. And they are super important because they're for the carbon cycle on Earth because they're responsible for half the photosynthesis that gets done every year. So that land plants like trees and grasses and everything are responsible for the other half. So phytoplankton are responsible for a lot of the oxygen that you breathe, for instance. They're the base of all the marine food webs. So all the ocean creatures that you can imagine start off, their energy starts off as from phytoplankton collecting that energy from the sun. And they use that, and to do that, they use the pigment chlorophyll to absorb the sunlight. And chlorophyll is the green pigment in plants and in phytoplankton, and you can see it from space. So on this image, I put in the upper right, there's the Ross Sea, which is one of the seas around Antarctica that Alice introduced you to before. And this is a phytoplankton bloom in the Ross Sea. And you can see how it's green, and you can see some swirls. And that's because the phytoplankton get transported around with the eddies and the currents in the ocean. And so they do not swim or anything like that. So they're an important part of our science. And so we need a way of measuring how fast they're growing. And to do that, we use a metric called net primary productivity, or NPP. And I will refer back to that later in the talk. And so to think about what controls NPP, or the phytoplankton growth in the ocean, we have three primary things, and that is light, because they need light from the sun to do their photosynthesis. So if you have more light, they can do more photosynthesis. They also need nutrients, just like land plants do, to be able to grow. And temperature controls the rate at which they do all these photosynthesis and things like that. So if it's warmer, they photosynthesize faster and they grow faster. So if it's cooler, they're photosynthesizing a bit more slowly. And so another thing, so now we want to talk about specific to Antarctic ecosystems. A few things that I thought that were worth pointing out for this talk are that Antarctic food chains are short and efficient. And to kind of illustrate this concept, I am pulling an illustration that I did for a biological oceanography textbook. And this one shows different ocean food chains in different ocean environments. So the top two, you have the open ocean and the continental shelf, and I won't go into the details here, but you can basically see that they're a lot more complicated than the bottom one, which is an upwelling region, and the Antarctic ecosystem, marine ecosystem, is an example of an upwelling region. And you can see it's like only 3 levels long. They're super efficient in this kind of cold upwelling environment. So now if we take that food chain and you look at the top predator on there, that's a baleen whale that's probably eating the krill mostly. But in Antarctica, we have lots of different like little short food chains. So you could replace that baleen whale with an emperor penguin, or a Adelie penguin on the top there, or a Weddell seal, or a toothfish. So really lots of different kinds of biodiversity there, and short and efficient food chains. And then the next thing I want to teach you about the Antarctic ecosystems is that all the animals, the phytoplankton and the animals down there, are adapted to cold, icy conditions. So they thrive in these kind of conditions. And I put some paintings that I did that would kind of illustrate these concepts. One is that the sea ice is really, like in the springtime when the sea ice melts back, it really controls when the phytoplankton can start growing and start photosynthesizing and fueling that marine food web. So that sea ice melt really is determining when the phytoplankton can start growing. And then secondly, the krill are a really integral part of the marine ecosystem around Antarctica, and they use the sea ice for protection against the ocean currents, so they don't get swept away out to sea, and also they kind of graze the marine, algae that grow on the underside of the sea ice as well. So they use it as a food source as well. And then the emperor penguins. They also use sea ice and need the cold down there because during the winter they breed on the sea ice, and so that's where they lay their eggs and they raise their young chicks on the sea ice. So they really need these things. And if the last thing I'm going to tell you is that, of course, and you might have guessed, that warming temperatures and melting sea ice are going to impact basically all parts of the marine ecosystem because they're adapted to these cold, icy conditions. As they start to change and the sea ice melts, everything's going to be impacted, and that's what we're basically talking about today. And to be able to project those conditions, we really need to use a climate model or an Earth system model, and Alice will talk about that.
All right. So the next part of our talk on that roadmap was to talk to you a little bit about modeling the Earth. So Imagine that we could build a virtual Earth that has interacting components, chaotic elements, and connections between different parts of the globe. But there's also some order within that chaos. There's phenomena like storms that you can kind of see, and ways that you can test what we can do, what humans do that impact the Earth system. And so we actually have built this virtual Earth, and you're seeing an example of one right here. This is a model from NASA, and you can see that even though it's a model, it looks a lot like what you might see from a satellite. You can see hurricanes forming off of the coast of Africa and moving across the Atlantic. You can see storms coming across the mid-latitudes like we have here. And so we use Earth system models as a virtual laboratory to understand the climate, the Earth system, how all these different parts interact. And so what is an Earth system model fundamentally? Basically, we have different parts of the Earth system that represent the atmosphere, the ocean, the land, sea ice, land ice, and then some ecosystems. And we can experiment by taking parts out of this or adding parts to understand how these different components interact. But ultimately, what they are is Earth system models are math. They're made of math equations. There will not be tests on these. You don't have to worry about it. But we have a bunch of different equations that evolve and interact over time. We exchange heat or water between different parts of the Earth system. And so we have all these equations. We solve them in boxes that we've divided the globe up into a grid of boxes that goes up through the atmosphere or down through the ocean. And we can evolve these equations over time so that the ocean and atmosphere interact together, and we can see what would happen in the future. An Earth system model has thousands of lines of computer code, like many, many equations that we use. And many of these equations we've been studying for hundreds of years. So the way that fluids move, the way that heat is exchanged between different parts of the Earth system. So they're really a mature technology. And we run these on supercomputers in Wyoming, excuse me, the NSF NCAR supercomputer up there. And the specific model that we use and that we develop here at NSF NCAR with community partners at universities and national labs both in the US and around the world is the Community Earth System Model version 2 specifically is what we'll be showing you here today. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the data set we'll be using. So as I mentioned, we use a model and some equations where we have some initial conditions, so say the temperature in the present day, and we evolve these equations so that we could predict a future temperature. Well, what happens in our grid box? Say there's a grid box over Boulder, and there's obviously temperature variation. So let's say there's little differences or uncertainties in that initial temperature. What would that do to our predictions? So we can run our model again with slight differences to this initial state, something so small we might not even be able to measure it. And what happens over time is that these tiny differences evolve into different answers, but all of these different answers are actually equally likely futures. And so we can get statistics about what's more or less likely based on all these different simulations. So we're using the exact same model code, the exact same computer, everything's the same. We've just said, well, now the temperature is, whatever temperature plus 0.0000001. And over time, that will cause a difference in our model solution. So a whole group of these simulations is called an ensemble, and a single one is called an ensemble member. And I just want to make sure that we define that so that if we talk about ensembles or ensemble members in the future, you can think we're thinking about all these different groups of equations. This is done for both weather and climate models, so we're using this Earth system or a climate model. We just run these longer than a weather model, but you might have seen things like this done when you're looking at a hurricane forecast and you see all those spaghetti tracks where the hurricane might go. That's the exact same concept here. We're just running it, for a couple days. And the specific data that we're using is the CESM2 large ensemble. So we're looking at 50 of these simulations. They're global. We run it from 1850 to 2100, and then we can get statistics about that. So that's what is the foundation of the results that both Kristen and I will show you. So I'm a physical Earth system modeler. But what's really important and what makes this project possible is that our Earth system models also include ecosystems. And specifically for this, we have the ocean ecosystem. And as Kristen said earlier, light, temperature, nutrients are really important for driving the ecosystem. And so she's going to talk a little bit more about how we model those ecosystems and their interaction.
this to non-modelers. I was like, okay, I'll just do a quick watercolor to say what I think a real world plankton ecosystem would look like. And so this is just a whole bunch of phytoplankton and zooplankton. Those are the little critters that eat the phytoplankton, and they're all mixed together in a natural ecosystem. But in an Earth system model, we can't possibly model every species that's out there. So we need to group them into functional types. So we call these phytoplankton functional types and zooplankton functional types. And so these are grouped by kind of their functional role in the ecosystem or in the global carbon cycle. Which is what's important to model in the climate model or in the Earth system model. So different types of phytoplankton are specialized for different environments, and then the zooplankton types eat the phytoplankton, and then we can so we model all these in the Earth system, and then we can use the output from the Earth system model to hook it up to other models, like a fish model, for instance. So that allows us to kind of expand what we're seeing with the Earth system model into actual ecosystems. And so for the projects that we'll be describing today, we're using several of these models where we take the CSM to large ensemble simulations that Alice just described, and then we take that output and kind of force these other ecosystem models. And in this case, they're specific for the Antarctic region. So we use seasonal sea ice data for projecting how penguins are going to do. So emperor and Adelie penguins, we have separate models for each one of those. They prefer different ice levels, so they're a little different. And then we can take chlorophyll from the model and ocean surface temperatures, and that'll give us an estimate of how well the krill are growing. And the krill are really an essential part of the ecosystem, a keystone species within the Antarctic ecosystem. So that's important to have that. And then we also have a fish model that we use, and that one takes in food resources. So basically those zooplankton functional types that I was talking about, and then uses those abundances and along with ocean temperature at both the top of the ocean and the bottom of the ocean to kind of understand how well fish would grow in the regions. So with that, we'll start off on the science results.
All right. So I think nobody put on there thinking of Antarctica like green waters, but I think this is a really great picture to show Antarctic ecosystems and how green these waters are. They're super productive. So you can see the penguin hanging out there, and those waters are just teeming with phytoplankton. So we're going to share some science results for kind of two science questions we have. The first one that I will talk about is we're trying to use our model to understand where the most important locations around Antarctica are for the ecosystem, and then Kristen will talk a little bit more about when we can know that the Earth system is in a new state around Antarctica. All right, so this little penguin wants to know, where are the most important locations around Antarctica? And you've seen this food web. And so our first hypothesis is that the most valuable places around Antarctica will be near where there's high concentrations of species. So how do we actually use our models to find this out? So as Kristen talked about, we have phytoplankton directly from the CESM Earth system model. And what we're showing here is in the present day, the net primary productivity, as she described, and the darker colors are where there is more net primary productivity. And what you can see here is that there are some areas around the Antarctic continent that are very green. So like right here in the Ross Sea, there's some here off the coast. This is the Amundsen Sea. Off the tip of the peninsula is super green, but then there are some other green spots here as well. So these are areas where there's tons and tons of phytoplankton. So we say, okay, we got this base of the food web here. Let's go and start thinking about other parts of the food web. So the next level up, we're able to use these models, the Earth system model coupled with krill, basically habitat models, and look at where would krill grow best in the Antarctic summer. And the dark colors here are showing the areas where krill have optimal conditions for growth. So they have a very limited temperature range they can live in. If it gets too warm, they die. And so we can see here, again, there are some areas that stand out as hotspots where krill are going to thrive. And some of them are the same. We do the same thing with our fish model. We say, okay, we have a fish model that represents toothfish, like fish. where is the area where they would have the most biomass. So the darker browns here are areas where toothfish would be most likely to be found and have the highest biomass. And then we finally look at some penguin models. So what you're seeing here on the bottom are emperor penguins on the left, Adelie penguins on the right, and locations of their present day colonies, or the dots. And then because we know how far these penguins swim, there are other scientists, some of the biologists we work with, they put little trackers on the penguins and they can see how far they go. We can get an idea of how big these colonies are, how far the penguins usually swim, and we can get an estimate of how many penguins are going to be foraging for food in different parts around Antarctica. And so those are the darker colors. There's more penguins looking for food in those areas. And so we look across the whole ecosystem here, all these different parts of the ecosystem, and say, all right, where's the most important location for all of these? And you can see kind of off the, just by eye, there are some places that stand out for all of them. Like the Ross Sea has dark colors for all of these different species. And so what we've done is we've combined all that information to find these most important locations for the ecosystem across all species. And we created something called the Antarctic Ecosystem Value Index. And here, the darker colored points are showing you areas that are the most valuable across all of those parts of the ecosystem. And so, as I pointed out, the Ross Sea, which you could see by eye was pretty valuable, has dark colors in the present day. But there are other places that stand out as well. And these happen to be like here in East Antarctica, around the peninsula, those areas. So what we've done with this index is we've looked at the top 5%, the top 10%, and the top 25% values to try to figure out where are really the most valuable around Antarctica. And we're looking by management region. Those are the black lines on here because that's the way that we'll talk more about management in a minute, but we've looked in each of these management regions to find these locations. And what we find is that these valuable areas are primarily located along the coast. So these really dark greens are along the coast all around Antarctica. And so you might say, well, why is that the case? And it turns out that they coincide with something called a polynya that happen along the coast. So a polynya is an area along the coast. So these, I told you way back earlier, Antarctica is super cold, super windy. You get these winds that flow off the Antarctic coast. They're coming down at actually like hurricane force speeds. They can be very fast. And they blow out over the open ocean at the continent or at the coast, and they blow the sea ice actually away from the coast, creating these areas of open water. And this both is really important for the whole Earth system. It drives the ocean circulation around the whole continent, actually around the whole globe, not just the whole continent. But it also provides an area where penguins can access the ocean and get to their food resources. The sea ice is less concentrated there. It's often a little thinner there. And so in the spring, when the sun comes up, the phytoplankton can start blooming sooner. And so these coastal polynyas are really important for the ecosystem, and they're important across all of those species. So another thing we can do with our model, everything I've showed you so far is present day, but we can run these models out farther into the future, and we've actually looked to 2090 because we're interested in how these might change over time. If you're going to plan management, you might want to have an idea about how the ecosystem could change. So our hypothesis here was that the valuable areas are going to change dramatically by the end of the century because the sea ice is changing a lot. And we were somewhat surprised to find that in the future, by 2090, a lot of these actual locations are pretty consistent over time. You can see the Ross Sea is important now. It stays important in the future. This is the Admonton Sea. It's important both now and the future. There are some changes. The sea ice has shrunk back quite a bit, and so the peninsula is having a little bit more trouble up here because some of the ice-dependent species can't survive there anymore. The same with East Antarctica, but there are some areas that are consistently valuable now and into the future, and so that will have implications for how you might want to manage Antarctica, as we'll talk about later. All right. So now we'll talk about our second science question.
Yep. Okay, so the science question that I will talk about is like, when is like the Antarctic ecosystem and the Antarctic environment really in a new state? And for this, we use a statistical method called time of emergence. And this is when like a new state emerges from historical variability, or like just the historical state of the climate. And so to be able to explain this, I found it was maybe best to talk about a story rather than talking about statistics a whole bunch. So, so imagine that that you've been visiting a nice place in the mountains that's and you go every May, and say you've been going there since the 1980s or something, and so you started going there, and every year there's always snow on the ground, still in May. Sometimes there's a little less, sometimes there's a little more, but on average, always some snow. But then by the 1990s, you notice there's kind of a way, there's less snow than there used to be, but it's still like there were low years before during the 80s, but so and this isn't really like that different from those low years during the 80s. So it's not really a new state. But then by the 2000s, you notice that there's really way less snow in May at this special spot in the mountains. And this is lower than even the lower years during the 1980s. So something significant has happened here. But then if we just continue on the story, and by the 2010s, you notice that not only is there no snow, but there's actually a little flower there. And no snow at all, like I said. And then by the 2020s, like present day, let's say there's just like no snow and there's a lot of flowers. And so to translate this to time of emergence, the first one would be you can have increases and decreases of certain things. So in this case, we're seeing a decrease in snow, and there's a new climate state emerging in the 2000s, and that's because this like little amount of snow that was there is actually way less than even on the low years during the 1980s. So now we're like into a new state, and that's a time of emergence for a decrease in snow. And on the contrary, you can also have an increase, a time of emergence for an increase in something. And for this, there's a time of emergence for an increase in flowers in the 2010s. And so this, I hope, just kind of helps you understand like what I mean by time of emergence when we're kind of entering a new state. And you'll notice that there are some similarities with some of the Antarctic stories that we'll show here. So now back to Antarctica. I'm just going to talk about, I did this analysis for 7 different Antarctic regions, and those are shown in the red shaded areas here. You can also see the penguin colonies on that map. And then we're going to look at how the time of emergence happens for each one of these parts of the ecosystem, from sea ice to phytoplankton, krill growth, fish, and then the emperor penguins and the Adelie penguins. And so when I first started this project, I thought, okay, so this ecosystem is super controlled by sea ice. Like every species or every animal there depends on the sea ice or is controlled by it in some way. So I thought first the sea ice will emerge, changes in sea ice declines because of climate warming will happen, and then every other species will kind of follow on from that. And you'll see that's not quite what happened, actually. So it was quite surprising, actually. So on these next sequence of slides, I'm going to show these timelines to show how things emerged in the Antarctic ecosystem throughout these different components of the Antarctic ecosystem. So these timelines, they start in year 2000, and they go to 2100. And then if something has increased in abundance, it'll be at the top of the timeline. And if it decreases in abundance or declines, then you'll see it on the bottom of the timeline. And each one of these little icons corresponds with these things in the lower right. So I looked at seasonal changes in sea ice and net primary productivity by phytoplankton, so spring and summer, and then spring and summer krill growth as well, so dividing up by the seasons. And then for fish and the penguins, we just looked at kind of their annual mean abundance. And so that's because they're longer lived species and the seasonality doesn't matter as much. So, but seasonality can really matter for phytoplankton and krill and sea ice, as you'll see. So, so we did this for the Antarctic Peninsula. I'll just show that one first. Like, so we saw that the first thing to emerge was not the sea ice, it was emperor penguins, declines in emperor penguins. So they're quite sensitive, and then we saw increases in fish and springtime krill growth, but this krill growth during the summer actually declines later in the century, and so do Adelie penguins. And then I'm just going to contrast this with droning Mondland, which is this eastern Antarctic region there. And this one had the earliest time of emergence for all the ecosystem components. It's very vulnerable. And you'll see, I think Alice showed that that was one of the places that changed a lot from going from the present day to the future state. And so it is really an area that's sensitive to climate change, and we see everything emerging quite early in that one. And we see increases in some things, but decreases in a lot of things as well. And then if we look at the Ross Sea, we see an entirely different story where actually phytoplankton, sea ice, krill growth, it doesn't really actually change at all from the historical state. So the only things that change are we get increases in Adelie penguins and decreases in emperor penguins. And so this really points to this particular region as a potential refuge from climate change for a lot of these parts of the Antarctic ecosystem. And then the Weddell Sea is also quite special. This one also has kind of a later time of emergence for emperor penguins, like so after, I think, almost to 2060 by the time they decline. But really, their populations hold on quite strong here, as well as in the Ross Sea. The declines are much less severe than are in other regions. In the Weddell Sea, you see a lot of increased krill growth in both the spring and the summer, and increased productivity, phytoplankton productivity, and increased fish. So the Weddell Sea actually becomes a lot more productive as the climate warms in this region. And then the last thing I want to point out with all these timelines, I put them all up there now for all 7 regions. And in contrast to what I actually thought was going to happen, the sea ice emerging first, that didn't happen. And in fact, it's either penguins or fish that emerge first in every single region. So it's these upper trophic levels, these the ones that are at the more the top of the food pyramid that actually are the most sensitive to climate change, and they're kind of like a bellwether to maybe changes to come. So they are they're the ones that show the changes the soonest, in contrast to sea ice. And this has implications, obviously, for Antarctic management, and that's what Alice is going to talk about.
All right. So we've talked a lot about the oceans around Antarctica, and I started by talking about the Antarctic Treaty. But the treaty actually doesn't apply to the oceans. The oceans are treated a little bit different. I feel a little funny talking about this because there are other experts in the room who know much more about this. But we'll talk a little bit more about how the Southern Ocean is managed. So the body that actually manages the Southern Ocean is called CAMLAR, which stands for the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. It's an organization of about 30 countries that meet one time per year in Hobart, Tasmania. And their meetings are invitation only. And so this is what it looks like in the room, a picture that Cassandra Brooks took, and she's also in the audience because she is invited to go to these. But CAMLAR is responsible for managing fishing and other marine activities, and their mandate is that they're required to use the best available science in their management decisions. But the way you actually define that can be a little bit more complicated. But they are responsible for enacting marine protected areas around Antarctica. So this map here shows different marine protected areas. So there's actually 2 that have been adopted. This little green one here, the South Orkney Islands, which was adopted in 2009. And then this bigger green one in the Ross Sea, adopted in 2016. And then you can see there are 4 proposals for marine protected areas, the Antarctic Peninsula in red. There are 2 in the Weddell Sea, so this phase 1 in dark purple and phase 2 in lighter purple. And then 3 kind of disconnected MPAs, marine protected areas in East Antarctica. So these are all proposed. They have not been enacted. They're still being debated. And it actually takes a really long time, and it's a really hard process to get an MPA enacted. And so what you're seeing here on the right now is the timeline for the Ross Sea MPA and when it was enacted. So it was proposed before 2003, and you can see the countries as they signed on. So it was proposed, there were some early allies, a bunch of countries agreed to it, and then it took a lot longer for some holdout countries to agree because the CAMLAR process requires unanimous consent to adopt any policy. And because all these countries are involved, it's fundamentally political, geopolitical. You might recognize the Ukrainian flag and the Russian flag up here in some of the last ones to adopt the MPA, and right now, there's no way geopolitically that they are going to agree to anything. So the Ross Sea MPA took over 14 years to actually be adopted from when it was proposed, and so it's a really difficult, long process for this to actually be enacted. So as part of the project that Kristen and I presented on, we worked with different people to try to span the science policy public interface. And I wish I could tell you, like, because of our work, there's a new MPA adopted. And unfortunately, that's just not the reality of how conservation works. But what we've tried to do is work as scientists with some boundary spanning organizations. So here you can see the Pew Charitable Trusts, Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, and Only One, which are these groups that have years of experience working in this space. And they work to bring some of the science to policymakers and to the general public, because a big part of how the Ross Sea MPA was adopted was the general public encouraging their delegates to CAMLAR to like put pressure on them to be able to actually adopt this. And so you were introduced to John at the very beginning of this. We worked with John Weller. He's a storyteller. He works with Only One. And we put together this website that has a lot of information about the science we do, but also tells stories about these different regions. So I have the website here in the QR code if you want to go explore there in the future. I think there's a lot of neat tools, but we're really working hard to figure out how to bring this forward and encourage people, not just policymakers, but also other people to learn about this area and how it impacts them and the rest of the world. All right, so with that, I think we're close to wrapping up, so we have a few key takeaways. You're first.
The first one is that models are tools that we can use to investigate change, and that spans the Antarctic food web, which we described today. And so we can use Earth system models combined with other models to kind of translate that for different ecosystems. Do the next one? Okay.
Oh, no.
Are you doing it?
Sorry.
We forgot what we're doing.
One of the other things we found is that the coastal polynyas around Antarctica are really valuable across the whole ecosystem.
And that Antarctic ecosystems are unique and they are changing, which we showed. And for instance, with the work that I showed, that penguins and fish may be the first ones to actually show the changes from climate change outside of like the historical variability that's been there. And more areas around Antarctica need careful management because these are amazing ecosystems and they need to be protected. So with that, thank you for listening, and we'll take any questions.